Hi, this is Ray Friedman, and this is another edition of Lights on MOR, where we get to hear from authors from MOR papers talk about the background and their ideas. And today we have Lori Yue from Columbia University, who is the proud winner of the MOR RRBM Best Paper Award for her paper, Firm Rhetorical Nationalism, Theory, Measurement, and Evidence from a Computational Analysis of Chinese Public Firms. So welcome, Lori.
Thank you for having me.
And to begin with, I'd like to ask you, what got you interested in the topic of corporate nationalism?
Nationalism has been a rise around the world. So in the US, President Trump ran with this slogan of Make America Great Again and the US first. So the trade war, tariff, geopolitics are part of the reality that we live with. In China, you also hear the slogan of China Dream, national rejuvenization. In Europe, there's Brexit a few years ago. So corporations have played a very active role in this environment, in embodying and shaping nationalism. Similarly, during the military conflicts just a few months ago between India and Pakistan, you observe that this kind of Indian fashion designer tap into this kind of surge in domestic nationalism and promote these kind of nationalism themed t-shirts and tote bags and fashion items. So it's really hard to ignore nationalism nowadays. And that as an orientational scholar, so the rise of nationalism have made me wonder, like what is like, why there's this kind of rise? And then what's corporation's role in it? And how does this kind of nationalism affect corporations? So this is how really I got interested in this topic of corporate nationalism.
Well, and it sounds like it's something that you could do cross-culturally. You could do a comparison of the way it works in the US and China and India. But I mean, what your comments here lead me into is what's the impact of having high or low levels of rhetorical nationalism? If there's clearly some benefits and some drivers that make companies want to do this.
Definitely. So what's the consequences, right? So I said firm benefit profit from it. Our MOR paper found the Chinese firm benefited from this kind of having high rhetorical nationalism. So we found there's a positive correlation between their rhetorical nationalism and their profitability. And the main mechanism is working through the domestic sales, domestic revenue. However, this is just correlation. It's not causal. I have to caution, researchers need to test more in the causal identification. I'm not saying that, advocating for nationalism necessarily lead to high profit. We have to be very clear about the downside doing so as well. So the downside doing so, including what? Including like you may have disadvantage in the international market. So in the endorsed Xinjiang cotton movement, for example, we observe that the kind of firm actually suffer in their domestic, you benefit from their domestic sale, but suffer in their international sale. So over the long run, they do not really have the kind of advantages over the long time period. And then, so we have to know that, endorsing the nationalism or having a high or low rhetorical nationalism is not really all good or all bad. There's advantages and disadvantages associated with it. However, there's also like internally employee management, for example. You can use kind of nationalism as an organizational value culture, and they help to you to increase the internal cohesion. But the downside is that you probably have too high nationalism, especially nationalism, is narrow defined based on religion, ethnicity, and that could result in this kind of exclusion, discrimination. That's not something we want.
So when it works for companies like in China, if you show nationalism, presumably consumers think better of you and want to buy your product. I can imagine in the US, it's probably more delicate with if you show nationalism, it might create a more split reaction and be a little bit harder to calculate what the impact would be.
Yeah, I think that's what you're talking about is just like consumers' attitudes, right? If the consumers are more receptive to this kind of nationalism sentiment, and then you get more support. I guess, that's in the Chinese context. In the US context, I think the consumers or the stakeholders constituency base are more diversified. So people have different reactions to the nationalism and how do you define the nationalism? So as a result of that, you got to be more careful. You may get more support from your supportive constituent base, consumer base, but also you may, even alienate some of these kind of domestic consumer base as well. So it's very,
Yeah,
I guess it's kind of similar to corporations taking stance sometimes on the controversial social political issues in the US society.
you spent a lot of time in the paper trying to talk about nationalism and different versions of what people mean by nationalism. What are the different kinds of nationalism that exist, and which ones did you focus on?
Nationalism is something that has been actually well studied in the general social science as well. To describe this, we don't really know 99% of the people in this country, perhaps, but still I strongly identify ourselves with this kind of nation. So there are other books like Gellner's Nationalism, Smith's National Identity are all classics in this field. The key debate in this literature is really like nation should be based on ethnicity or nation can be based on civic institution. So you heard the concept like economic nationalism that's related to like protectionist economic policy the country adopt. You heard about resource nationalism, so the country try to protect their energy or resource independence, adopt the kind of policy for that purpose. And you heard about techno-nationalism more recently, that's like country competed with each other in this kind of geopolitical context. And then so they promote the kind of technology policies. They help to, boost their own advantages in the technology area. What we are trying to do in this MOR paper, and also my other work related theory paper as well, so really to say, hey, corporations may not be so passive. As example, I just gave you at the beginning of our conversation, you can see that the Chinese firm profited from it, the Canadian firm profited from it, the Indian firm profited from it. And then the firm can actually actively use this kind of nationalism as their value or as their strategy, and for their internal management or external competition. So that is like, what we are trying to say here, when we add to this, it's really like organizational angle for nationalism and how nationalism can be actually actively adopted, manifested or embodied by this kind of corporation.
Well, I know you also talk about strategic factors that can determine rhetorical nationalism and socialization factors. What are those, and can you give an example of each?
Yeah. So that is related to what I'm saying, that corporate nationalism can either be a strategy or a value. So when I say it's a strategy, it is like to help the corporation to obtain the kind of support from domestic stakeholders like consumers, investors, subsidies from domestic government, and so on. So what might drive from to leverage nationalism as a strategy? So since it would be like resource dependence, the dependence on domestic market, for example, what we found in the MOR paper is that the firm that sell predominantly to the domestic market use more rhetorical nationalism words, okay? So this is what I mean by saying, this is determined by strategic factors. What I'm saying by socialization is really like corporations use nationalism as an intrinsic organizational value. So they can set the kind of goal of contributing to the national welfare, advance the national interest as organizational goal. So socialization factors are things like, when the organization are founded as certain types of organization, like say state-owned enterprises. So the sole goal is not really to make profit, but instead to implement the state's policy, advance the collective welfare. This kind of corporation is more likely to, intrinsically have the nationalism as their value and ideology.
One thing that's fascinating about your paper is this a set of research methods which are very different than most OB papers. Maybe it's starting to happen a little bit, but you work on word embeddedness. And that's a big topic that will take, an hour or hours to go through. But if you could give the audience a sense of what this method is and kind of why that was important to use.
Yeah, thank you for your kind of word. I have to thank my co-authors. When I work with them, they were still like PhD students. Now they're assistant professors. So they are really like the new generations, working on this cutting edge methodology in NLP, in machine learning, large language model. I learned so much working together with them. So what we have been doing essentially is just using this computational linguistic method that's just enabled during like past 10 years or so by this kind of rapid advancement in this machine learning and AI enabled methodology. Well, essentially what we are doing, so how do we measure firms' rhetorical nationalism? So the idea is very simple. So we want to calculate the percentage of words that are nationalism and then contained in the annual reports of this corporation. Okay, so we want to calculate frequency of these words occurrence. But in order to do that, we need a dictionary. We need a dictionary to define each of the 4 dimensions that we identify about how organization will manifest this kind of nationalism rhetorics. So, and how do we do it? So we start with this kind of human-coded keywords, but we know that human has limitation. We only know so much. And what's the beauty about this kind of machine, beautiful about this machine, is that the method being able to calculate, find their synonyms much efficient than we are. The basic idea is that the similar words, the words have similar meanings, co-occur, and they tend to occur together. So by looking at which word co-occur with other words, they're surrounding each other within, a certain window, and you are able to essentially calculate the relationship among all the words that appear in your corpus, hundreds of millions of words. And then now the advancement of this kind of large language model enable researcher not only to identify keywords, that what we did in MOR paper, but also the entire sentence. So whether sentence have conveyed a nationalism sentiment or not. So the analysis nowadays can be done at the sentence level. And so this is the methodology I'm doing on another research project.
And hopefully you're catching up with your younger scholars who introduced you to some of these ideas.
Yeah, definitely.
And all the best ideas are coming from the young new people.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, I mean, I can imagine with those last examples that, one reason is strategic, but I can also imagine sometimes it might be coercive forces, where you can imagine where you don't see it necessarily in your strategic interest or your personal values, but the dominant political environment makes you have to do it or you're eliminated.
Yeah, so that is a difference. People often ask me about the difference between nationalism and patriotism. So patriotism is something like, the love of nation. You are proud of nation, your motherland, you're proud, you have the strong identification with your cultural heritage and so on. And there's not, there's a benign, that's what we say, a benign version of nationalism, that's part of nationalism, but nationalism also have the other part that is like anti-foreignness. So like the foreign is not as good as us, and then we are, that we are good, the foreign are bad. That is more like militant version of nationalism. That's often part of it. And I think you're right. When you are coming to the international cooperation, and then you can create a lot of troubles. There are actually research showing that, when the firms are more nationalistic, and then they're engaging into this kind of acquisition merger overseas, and then they may have a harder time to complete the kind of deals.
I can also imagine an avenue of historic tracking of rhetoric nationalism to see how it might ebb and flow and be correlated with other dynamics going on politically, economically.
Yeah, definitely. It's not, that is what we say is a value or as a strategy. So when it's as a value, we expect it to be relatively stable, but in reality, you actually see it's not really the case. It's actually substantial variation. It goes higher and goes lower over time. It's co-vary with a historical context that firms embedded in. So that is actually tell us really like firms are very strategically, increase or decrease their nationalism rhetoric, and they see that's optimal in managing their environment.
Well, and this is wonderful work. We've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything that I've missed that you'd like to share with listeners?
Not really. It's like go read the paper.
Yeah,
A lot of efforts in developing this kind of paper. We don't really know what to expect because like we don't usually see this kind of methodology. Nationalism has never before our paper been measured at the firm level. It's really like at the country level or at the individual level. Read our paper, adopt our methodology, and help us understand more really like pros and cons of nationalism.
Well, Laura, it's wonderful work. It's both path-breaking theoretically and also methodologically. So your award is well deserved, and best luck on all the next projects that come from this.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share my work.